So we want to start just with reminding you what Amnesty and CND do, and also why we got involved, because these are often interesting personal stories, why you got involved. It's not obvious. You get involved for surprising reasons sometimes. Then I want to present the case in the broader political context of the importance of what you could call civil society organisations like ours, community groups, social movements, particularly in light of the dire situation of politics, of party politics. I think we've got a very important role today. Then John will explore some of the dynamics and the difficulties of single-issue movements, because we are both single-issue movements. Our movements are quite broad, but they're still single issues, okay? And I'll respond briefly to that. Then John will talk about working with other groups, the advantages and problems, and I'll kind of sum up at the end. And we're hoping it won't take more than 35 minutes. And then we're going to have a workshop afterwards, so people can come back to us with their comments. And we're hoping for some discussion from people who are, whether you're activists or not, people who are activists in social movements of one kind or another. Okay. So, is it me? Yeah, it's me. So it's me talking, and we're going to do this as double act. I hope we won't forget who's speaking next. A little bit about CND. Well, I suppose everybody knows that CND began really with the nuclear age, campaign for nuclear disarmament. It was a response to the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And really, in a way, our work has been to reproduce that horror in a way, not enviable in a way, we're not cheerful people, but we're really saying, don't let it ever happen again. And if you think about the history, we've had some success because it never has happened again. But of course, it's one thing not to use nuclear weapons, and it's another thing to have them. And our argument has always been that if you have nuclear weapons, and the more and more people who have nuclear weapons, the more likely they are to be used. Sooner or later, some mad politician, we know there are a lot of mad politicians around, are going to actually use a nuclear weapon. With horrendous circumstances for humanity, not just for the countries involved, but the probability of a long, long winter in which everybody will suffer, and massive contamination of our ecosphere. So that's what CND has been about, but it's also always been a peace movement. That's not necessarily, not all of us are pacifists, absolute believers in peace in all circumstances, but we do all believe that war is the last resort. It should never be easily entered into. War is a terrible, terrible human disaster. Always, always. It affects the most vulnerable most. Whatever you think about heroes and soldiers, it's actually the most vulnerable who get affected. So, we are against war, yes.
Do you really think you need the mic? You've only got 10 people.
Well, no, I'm communicating out there, you see. That's the difficulty.
It's a feedback, because you're very close to it.
Shall I be a bit quieter?
Reduce the gain a bit.
I'll reduce the volume. Okay, sorry. Sorry, I don't want you to be overwhelmed here. It's overwhelming the issues without my voice, isn't it? So, okay, I'll be a bit quieter. Sorry, I get a bit excited when I talk, and that's the trouble. We are a peace movement. We are also anti-nuclear, so we're against nuclear power, for example, which is a more controversial issue. Some people in the environmental movement even don't agree with us always about that. But we do think that this is a very dangerous technology, and we're concerned with the human effects of radiation in relation to this. And we do usually oppose wars. We're usually in there, marching in London or wherever, opposing Iraq, Afghanistan wars, and I think we've been proved right, by the way, about both those wars. They're quite pointless and self-defeating. So I think CND is a pretty good example of the tension that exists between pursuing a single issue, nuclear weapons, and the way we're pulled to broader issues. And it often occurs to me that we need to be putting forward an alternative international relations. Do you know what I mean? It's not just, you can't just isolate the nuclear issue. So we're pulled all the time. And that's a dilemma, in a way, that we want to talk about today.
Thank you, Richard. Amnesty, for me, I'm just going to fill you in, and if you know it already, I'm sorry. But as far as, the personal is also political, and the political is personal. And I suppose briefly, if I fill you in on the history of Amnesty International, it was all started in 1961 by a man called Peter Benenson. He read in a paper that there were these 3 Portuguese students who tasted freedom, and as a result of that, they were imprisoned. And he, like most decent-minded people, all decent-minded people, was outraged by that, and he thought to himself, what can I do to change that? Him, being a decent middle-class Englishman, decided that the best thing to do was to write a letter. He wrote a letter. Many of his friends wrote a letter. He got it in the Observer. More and more letters were written, and eventually they got listened to. They piled up. There's a general sense of outrage when we hear about injustice, and particularly when human rights issues are involved and people have been locked up for simply saying what they believe, religious or political beliefs, for attempting to stand up and make a political point and being locked up. We are, as human beings, outraged, and we recognise us in these people who are suffering from the power of the state. There's a sense in you and I, as individuals, of powerlessness and a certain sense of despair, because after all, who are we to stand up against a government, even our own government, who has minimal or at least a small amount of impact on our lives as far as whether they're going to turn up at our front door at 3 o'clock in the morning and throw us in prison, although I don't want to minimise the reach of government and the power that they have over us. In certain other states it's far more hard to actually speak up. And so this sense of powerlessness and despair can be debilitating. And so what I like about Amnesty and the journey that it's been for me is that I've got the opportunity to go out and speak to people, individual to individual, and to speak about what we can do to change things, can share the knowledge that we have as an international organisation of 3 million people about human rights abuses. I go out, speak to the individual, other members of Amnesty go out and speak to the individuals, and we recognise that as an abomination, because these are people's families, these are people's friends, these are people like you and I. And also, the appeal of Amnesty for me was the appeal of mixing with like-minded individuals. And with CND, it's a similar thing. If I attend a CND meeting, I can recognise that these people have similar but not identical views to me. And I think what we're doing here today is trying to address that and look at how to work together and affect change, how to cooperate. And obviously there are obstacles there and boundaries, but it's something we need to be aware of and address. But returning to the people in the group, in Amnesty in Leicester, the appeal of mixing with like-minded individuals, we've got a chance for discussion, a safe area for debate, for cooperation, and for moving forward and affecting change. And it's a simple message that we've got, that Amnesty have got. The simple message is that human rights matter, that there's a universal declaration of human rights, simple, straightforward principles that we want to defend, and we all in Amnesty, and generally, the general public, we don't think this is good and we want to change it. And it's that desire for change, once you get over the sense of helplessness and despair and powerlessness, that really is most effective and is a motivation. And I suppose the other thing that motivates me personally is that speaking about human rights abuses and writing those letters to MPs, whether it's our national MPs or local MPs or local representatives or our national representatives, whether it's Pete Salisbury or Liz Kendall, whose name I briefly forgot there, or David Cameron, or international representatives, ambassadors to the UN, or the representatives of other states, or of other states, President of Burma, for example, still want to speak up and use my voice because I have the freedom to use my voice and I can say what I think. And that is cathartic, because you've got two options. I have two options. I can stay silent or I can speak. And if I stay silent, I'm either a monster or not in touch with the way I feel, with the despair and the disgust about these things I hear about. Or I'm simply had my power taken away and I've given in. I've surrendered. And I don't really want to be that. It is cathartic, speaking up for yourself and for other people. And I've got the choice. I can either speak up or I can go to bed at night and not be able, and wake up at 3 in the morning and think, how on earth can these things happen? So it's not because I want to cure, or not because I have a naive idea that I can solve the problem, that there are these abuses in Burma, in North Korea, throughout the world. I don't think that me as an individual can stand up and solve those problems, but I do think that if I don't stand up, then I'm sitting down. If I don't speak up, then I'm staying silent. And that, I think, is an appeal that is overwhelming and wide-ranging through all these groups. And the disgust that we might feel, or the uneasiness that we might feel about politicians and our representatives, whether they be Liz Kendall or a member of a political party, that disgust and that despair and that hopelessness doesn't have to stay with us. And we can actually affect change as individuals and as organisations that are not political parties, that are unbiased, and organisations that share certain things, such as Amnesty and CND with the Arms Trade Treaty. And that, I think, is over to Richard.
Okay. Well, I share this feeling that when you talk to people about politics today, what you often get is despair and anger in combination. I find it actually particularly with young people. And it's an individual despair and anger. You know, what's going to happen to me? What are my prospects? But it's also a collective social despair, because we seem to be getting worse and worse, with no chance of getting better. And it's not just that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer and the people in the middle are being squeezed, which is certainly happening. Everybody, most people, yes, the 99%, things are getting worse in an economic sense. But it's also that our social goals have narrowed, so the only thing that matters anymore is earning more money and getting on, you know, in that economic sense, as though that was the be-all and end-all of things. And they're not even succeeding about that, are they? So I can understand the despair, and to some extent I share it. What's particularly depressing, I think, is that the policies that government pursue are making things worse, not better. And that there's no real, in the political scene, in the party political scene, there's no real alternatives. I do exempt the Green Party from that, but they're a small party. I mean, I do support the Green Party. They're a small party developing their popularity, their political effect, and I do think they're very well led at the moment. But nonetheless, if you look at mainstream politics in this country, there is no alternative. It's all privatisation, it's all the market, it's all neoliberalism. So why do I remain optimistic? Because I do, on the whole, remain a pretty optimistic person. You could explain that biographically in being, you know, the golden generation, part of the golden generation. We got used, unlike our young people, to things getting better and better. We were very, very lucky folks, my age folks. But on the other hand, I get hope and encouragement from looking at civil society, not at politics, but at all this. You look at Leicester, and you look at the huge range of organisations. All right, there might be recreational, there might be social, there might be community, there might be political, there might be all kinds of movements. Might be associated with a particular ethnic group, it might be associated with a particular church. There's a huge amount of solidarity and energy there. Of course, it's dispersed and fragmented, but people really working hard to make our society a better place and understanding that it's social dependence and social cooperation that really matters, in small ways and big ways. You can't construct a future from this mad individualism that is in charge. You just get more and more social evils. So when I look at civil society and I go to meetings and I hear people talk about quite a narrow issue, but nonetheless with a sense of public responsibility, that something matters more than just me and whether I get on. When I see that, then I'm encouraged. And it's massive in Leicester, you know. We are very lucky. We've got a huge civil society in here. We've got all the artistic movements and all the cultural movements, which are incredibly important because they bring a different desire, a different form of desiring. I mean, I think politics is about wanting things, but wanting things generally. But cultural movements and artistic movements express that in a different way. And that's so, so important, so, so important. So we've got terrific opportunities here. And if you think about where the conflicts lie today, they're not between the parties, actually. I mean, the Labour Party is getting together a little bit just now, but on the whole, they're between civil society organisations and governments. And again, think of the NHS, think of disability politics, think of almost any kind of political sphere you like. Think of poverty, child poverty. It's the social movements who are saying government is wrong, 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 not the other parties on the whole. Think of war and peace. It's movements like CND who are saying the Iraq war is wrong and the Muslim initiative and stop the war. So the war is wrong, the war is wrong, it's wrong. You can't have war all the time because, you know, foreign policy at the moment is based on war. So that's where the conflicts come today. And so we have huge opportunities working together to construct an alternative within civil society, within what Antonio Gramsci called civil society. We can construct there a new culture, a new hegemony, by aligning, by working together, by talking to each other, by coming up with a real alternative. We're doing it, actually. We're already doing it. And these sort of events are part of that process. So that's the optimistic bit.
So to me, limitations, I'd agree with everything that Richard said, certainly that. But, and particularly today, I don't know if you may have noticed the banner outside of the Bulletproof Arms Trade Treaty. And that's a campaign that Amnesty are working out, really focusing on at the moment, because we've got about 75 days until the UN formulate an arms trade treaty. If you want to hear more about that, then we'll chat about it later, that's fine. And the overlap with the arms trade treaty, as far as Amnesty is concerned and CND, is quite clear. We're campaigning for a bulletproof arms trade treaty that's transparent, that controls the supply of arms to various regimes and individuals throughout the world. And we've got to ask ourselves, well, do we really want to speak with the same voice? Because Amnesty supporters and CND supporters are not necessarily the same individuals, and we don't want to lose focus. We don't want to pretend to ourselves that we are identical, because we're not. And if people want to be members of Amnesty, then they choose to be. If they want to put their energies in that direction, then they choose to. And if they want to put their energies in the direction of CND, they choose to do that. And there is a limit to everybody's time and everybody's resources. And obviously there are disagreements. We're not identical, and I'm sure that Richard and I can argue about things until the cows come home, or indeed later. But then if Amnesty and CND come to blows, then they've won. The people who are indeed saying that we should have Trident and saying that we can't possibly have an arms trade treaty because it's never worked before, and that it's interfering with the business of the decent, honest business of manufacturing and supplying arms, that is not a worthwhile pursuit to have a treaty. If we fight, then they've won. One individual does not have to have the same opinions as another individual, Richard, and one group, Amnesty, does not have to have the same opinions as another group, CND. We have to disagree, and we have to be clear about that, and we have to be clear about what we disagree about. Freedom of speech, after all, is pointless if we're just all singing with the same voice. If we're all saying the same thing, there's no point in having freedom of speech, and it's respecting differences that is one of the things that is vitally important. And, of course, if we look at the coalition, or if we look at political parties, and we're aware that they make the compromises and that they come to some kind of mutual collective decision or agreement, that can water things down, that it can be a great obstacle to progress, and that it can be debilitating. And this is all very depressing, but it's not necessarily what defines Amnesty and CND working together, or Amnesty and Friends of the Earth, or CND and Friends of the Earth, or as the number of organisations go out, then the different arrangements get more complicated. But obviously there are overlaps between these groups, and there are overlaps between the interests of Amnesty and the interests of CND and the interests of other groups that are not necessarily, they're not coincident. We've got to ask ourselves the question, are nuclear weapons a simple issue? Is nuclear disarmament a simple issue? If it was, then we wouldn't have this problem. We wouldn't be speaking or suggesting that we spend so much money on Trident, or indeed spending so much money on Trident. And if human rights were a simple issue, then we wouldn't be in the situation we are now, 60 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when Syria, Bahrain, Burma, North Korea, the United States, and vast numbers of countries who've got vast problems. We would be in a situation where we've got war in the Congo and Sudan. We'd be a peaceful planet, and that clearly hasn't happened. They're not a simple issue. But something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was an attempt to simplify things, to simplify war, to simplify issues where religions collide, where political beliefs collide, where national identities collide, where one individual or a group decide that someone or a group of individuals are standing in the way to what they want. And that obstacle has to be overcome by force, has to be overcome by taking the human rights of those individuals away, or those groups away. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Arms Trade Treaty is an attempt to stand up and simplify things, to oversimplify things, but if you don't simplify things, then how can we be clear about what we want? How can we actually draw clear boundaries about what we want and what we need as human beings, as individuals, and say, this is the process whereby we're going to reach it. And of course, everyone agreeing it's not going to happen. And we're never going to be right 100%, and we're never going to agree 100%. But that doesn't make it wrong, because it is, in my opinion, in a fair few others' opinions, it's better to act than to stand up and to speak out in our millions than to give up, because it's hopeless. You can despair, you can give up, but once you give up on your fellow human beings, once you give up on members of your family, or people you don't know, people who are in the brotherhood of man, not group, then you've given up on yourself as well. And to have hope can cause despair, and it can cause despair for me and probably for you, because once you have hope, you know that you're not doomed, and you've got to put the effort in to make things happen, to make things change. And a little hope can cause a lot of suffering, but a lot of hope, which when you've got 3 million or however many millions worth of members, when you've got 6 billion people throughout the world, each one of them with a little bit of hope, then surely something good can come from that. And in fact, hope really isn't the worst thing in the world. And what, is that still me? It is, isn't it? So then I was going to move on to strategies of working
I think
together.
I've been timing us. We've had 26 minutes. I think we should sort of come to an end and continue the discussions in the workshop.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I would just like to say one last thing. You might want to say one last thing.
Yes.
Okay.
Good. Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I think we've got very similar dilemmas in different movements, because the big debate in CND is, should you just concentrate on nuclear disarmament, or should you have all these other issues? You know, should you take on nuclear power? Should you think about foreign policy? Should you have a policy on Libya? Should you have a policy on Syria? Okay. Now, on the whole, I'm in the second camp, and for a very definite reason, because I think single-issue movements are very limited, and we all know they are. I don't think we'll get nuclear disarmament unless other things change in the world. I don't. You know, even though I'm in CND, I don't. So the logic of my position is that is you are willing to link, you're willing to have umbrella groups, you're willing to work together, and you work on the basis that eventually we probably do need a new party. Not a party like the existing parties, but a party that's really educational, has a really educational relation to its public, that does create a new culture, that brings it all together. You see, we've got it, but it's all in fragments. We need to bring it all together. Okay, so I am a broad single issue rather than narrow single issue person, and that's the case, I argue, within CND quite consistently. But it's a genuine dilemma, and I know, talking to Jonathan, that there are very similar issues there. So we want to have a workshop where people who are active in social movements, just a quick workshop. What time was it we were going to have it? Not about now, was it? Another half hour?
Oh yeah, about half an hour.
In about half an hour. Round here, we want to have a workshop where we take your views about broad and narrow, the prospects, civil society, different kinds of civil society organisations. There are lots of different kinds. CND and Amnesty are one particular kind of civil society organisation. So thanks ever so much for listening.
Cheers.
Okay.